The night on which I discovered that Nikola's drugs had been stolen was destined to prove unpleasant in more senses than one. The sweetest tempered of men could scarcely have failed to take offence had they been treated as the captain had treated me. I told him in so many words, and with as much emphasis as I was master of, that I had distinctly seen the Chinaman standing upon the main deck of his steamer. The second engineer had also entered the same report. His evidence, however, while serving to corroborate my assertion, was of little further use to me, inasmuch I had still better proof that what I said was correct, namely, that the medicines were missing. Under the circumstances, it was small wonder that I slept badly. Even had the cabin been as large as a hotel bedroom, and the bunk the latest invention in the way of comfortable couches, it is scarcely possible I should have had better rest. As it was, the knowledge that I had been outwitted was sufficient to keep me tumbling and tossing to and fro from the moment I laid my head upon the pillow till the sun was streaming in through my porthole next morning. Again and again I went over the events of the previous day, recalling every incident with photographic distinctness, but always returning to the same point. How the man could have obtained admittance to the saloon at all was more than I could understand, and having got there, why he should have stolen the bottles of medicine, when there were so many other articles which would have been of infinitely more value to him scattered about, was, to say the least, incomprehensible. Hour after hour I puzzled over it, and at the end was no nearer a solution of the enigma than at the beginning. At first I felt inclined to believe that I must have taken them from the bag myself, and for security's sake had placed them elsewhere. A few moments' search, however, was sufficient to knock the bottom out of that theory. Hunt high and low where I would, I could discover no traces of the queer little bottles. Then I remembered that when I had sent the steward forward for them to the Don's cabin the previous afternoon, I had taken them from the bag and placed them upon the deck beside the old man's bunk. Could I have left them there? On reconsidering the matter more carefully, however, I remembered that before leaving the cabin I had replaced them in my bag, and that as I carried them back to my berth I had dumped the satchel against the corner of the saloon table. I was afraid that I might have broken them. So this effectually disposed of that theory too. At least the suspense or irritation, by whichever name you may describe it, became unbearable, and unable to remain in bed any longer. I rose, dressed myself, and prepared to go on deck. Entering the saloon, I found the steward busied over a number of coffee cups. "Good morning, sir," he said, looking up from his work. "If you'll excuse me my saying so, sir, you're about early." "I was late in bed," I answered, with peculiar significance. "How is it, my friend, that you allow people who have no right there to enter the saloon and to thieve from passengers' cabins?" "To thieve, sir?" the man replied, with a startled tone. "I'm sure I don't understand you, sir." "I allow no one to enter the saloon when there has no right to be there." I glanced at him sharply, wondering whether the fellow was as innocent as he pretended to be. "At any rate," I said, "the fact remains that some one entered my cabin last night while I was on deck, and stole the medicines with which I am treating the old gentleman in the cabin yonder." The man looked inexpressibly shocked. "God bless my soul alive, sir, you don't mean that," he said, with a falter in his voice. Surely you don't mean it." "But I do mean it," I answered. "There can be no sort of doubt about it. When I left the old gentleman's cabin yesterday, I carried the bag containing the medicines back with me to my own berth, locked it, and hung it upon the peg inside the looking-glass with my own hands. After that I went on deck, returned to my cabin an hour or so later, opened the bag, and the bottles were gone." "But, sir, have you any idea who could have taken them?" the man replied. "I hope you don't think, sir, how I should have allowed such a thing to take place in this saloon without my knowledge." "I hope you would not," I answered, "but that does not alter the fact that the things are missing." But don't you think, sir, the young lady herself might have come in search of you, and when she found you were not there, did the next best thing, and took away the medicines to use herself?" "At present I do not know what to think," I replied with some hesitation, for that view of the case had not presented itself to me. "But if there had been anything underhand going on, I think I can promise the culprit that it will be made exceedingly hot for him when we reach our destination." Having fired this parting shot, I left him to the contemplation of his coffee cups, and made my way up the companion ladder to the deck above. It was a lovely morning, a brisk breeze was blowing, and the steamer was running fairly steady under a staysail and a foresail. It was not the sort of morning to feel depressed, and yet the incidents of the previous night were a little uncomfortable. Nikola had trusted me, and in the matter of the medications at least I had been found wanting. I believed at the moment I would have given all I possessed, which was certainly not much, but still a good deal to me, to have been able to solve the mystery that surrounded the disappearance of those drugs. Shortly before 8 bells the skipper emerged from the chart room and came along the hurricane deck towards the poop. Seeing me, he waved his hand, and after he had descended the ladder from the main deck, bade me good morning. "I'm afraid our accommodation is not very good," he said, "but I trust you have passed a fairly comfortable night. No more dreams of one-eared Chinaman, I hope?" From the tone in which he spoke, it was plain that he imagined I must have been dreaming on the previous evening. Had it not been for the seriousness of my position with Nikola, I could have laughed aloud when I thought of the shell I was about to drop into the skipper's camp. "Dreams or no dreams, Captain Windover," I replied, "I have to make a very serious complaint to you. It will remain then for you to say whether you consider that the assertion I made to you last night was, or was not, founded upon fact. As I believe you are aware, I was instructed by my principal, Dr. Nikola, to join this vessel in the Thames, and to take charge of Don Miguel de Moreno until his arrival in Newcastle on time. Dr. Nikola was fully aware of the difficulty and responsibility of the task he had assigned to me, and for this reason he furnished me with a number of very rare drugs, which I was to administer to the patient as occasion demanded. In the letter of instructions which I received prior to embarking, I was particularly warned to beware of a certain Chinaman, whose peculiar characteristic was that he had lost half an ear. In due course I joined your vessel, and attended the Don, using the drugs to which I have referred, and afterwards returned them to my cabin. A quarter of an hour or so later I made my way to the deck, where I found myself suddenly brought face to face with the Asiatic of whom I had been warned. On the recommendation of the chief engineer, I reported the matter to you. You searched the ship, found no one at all like the man I described, and from that time forward set down the story I had told you either as a fabrication on my part or the creation of a dream. "Pardon me, my dear sir, not a fabrication," the skipper began, "only a—" "Pardon me in your turn," I replied. "I have not quite finished. As I have inferred, you treat the matter with contempt. What is the result?" I returned to my cabin, and before retiring to rest, in order to make sure that they are ready at hand in case I shall require them during the night, opened the bag in which the medicines until that moment had been stored. To my consternation, they are not there. Some one had entered my cabin during my absence and stolen them. I leave you to put what construction on it you please, and to say who that some one was." The captain's face was a study. But, he began. "Buts will not end the matter," I answered, I'm afraid rather sharply. "There can be no getting away from the fact that they are gone, and that some one must have taken them. They could scarcely walk away by themselves. But supposing your suspicions to be correct, what possible use could a few small bottles of an unknown medicine be to a man like a Chinaman? Had he taken your watch and chain or your money, I could understand it. But from what you say, I gather that nothing else is missing." Nothing else, I replied, in the tone of a man who is making an admission that is scarcely likely to add to the weight of the argument he is endeavouring to adduce. Besides, continued the skipper, there are 100 other ways in which the things might have been lost or mislaid. Last night the ship was rolling heavily. Why might they not have tumbled out and have slipped under your bunk behind your bags? I've known things like that occur. And would the ship have closed the bag again, may I ask? And would the ship have closed the bag again, may I ask? I answered scornfully. No, no, Captain, I'm afraid that won't do. The man I reported to you last night, the one-eared Chinaman, is aboard your ship, and, for some reason best known to himself, has stolen some of my property, therefore not only inconveniencing me, but placing in absolute danger the life of the old man whom I was sent on board to take care of. As the thief is scarcely likely to have jumped overboard, he must be on board now, and as he would not be likely to have stolen the bottles only to smash them, it stands to reason that he must have them in his keeping at the present moment. And suppose he has, what do you want me to do? I want you to find him for me, I answered, or if you don't care to take the trouble to put sufficient men at my disposal, and allow me to do so. On hearing this, the captain became very red and shifted uneasily on his feet. My dear sir, he said a little testily, much as I would like to put myself out to serve you, I must confess that what you ask seems a little unreasonable. Don't I tell you I have already searched the ship twice in an attempt to find this man, and each time without success. Upon my word, I don't think it's fair to ask me to do so again. In that case, I am very much afraid I have no alternative to make a complaint to you in writing, and to hold you responsible should Don Miguel de Moreno lose his life through this robbery which has been committed, and which you will not help me to set right. What the captain would have answered in reply to this I cannot say. It is quite certain, however, that it would have been something sharp, had not the Dofia Consuelo made her appearance from the companion hatch at that moment. She struck me as looking very pale, as if she had passed a bad night. The skipper and I went forward together to meet her. Good morning, I said, as I took the little hand she held out to me. I hope your great-grandfather is better this morning. He has passed a fairly good night and is sleeping quietly at present, she answered. The steward is sitting with him now while I come up for a few moments to get a little fresh air on deck. The skipper made some remark about the beauty of the morning, and while he was speaking I watched the girl's face. There was an expression upon it I did not quite understand. I'm afraid you have not passed a very good night, I said, after the other had finished. Yesterday's anxiety must have set you more than you allowed me to suppose. I will confess that it did upset me, she answered with a pretty foreign accent, and the expressive gesticulation which was so becoming to her. I've had a wretched night. I had such a terrible dream that I have scarcely recovered from it yet. I'm sorry to hear that, the skipper and I answered almost together, while I added, pray tell us about it. It does not seem very much to tell, she answered, and yet the effect of it produced upon me is just as vivid now as it was then. After you left the cabin last night, Dr. Ingleby, I sat for a little while by my grandfather's side, trying to read, but finding that impossible. I retired to rest, lying upon the bed. The steward is kind enough to make up for me upon the floor. I was utterly worn out, and almost as soon as I closed my eyes I fell asleep. How long I had been sleeping I cannot say, but suddenly I felt there was someone in the room who was watching me. Who it was I could not tell, but that it was someone or something utterly repulsive to me I felt certain. In vain I endeavoured to open my eyes, but, as in most nightmares, I found it impossible to do so. And all the time I could feel this loathsome thing, whatever it was, drawing closer and closer to me. Then, putting forth a great effort, I managed to wake, or perhaps to dream that I did so. I had much better have kept my eyes closed, for leaning over me was the most horrible face I have ever seen or imagined. It was flatter than that of a European, with small narrow eyes and such cruel eyes. Good heavens! I cried, unable to keep silence any longer. Can it be possible that you saw him too? Meanwhile, the skipper, who had been leaning against the bulwarks, his hand thrust deep in his pockets, and his cap upon the back of his head, suddenly sprang to attention. "Can you remember anything else about the man?" he inquired. The girl considered for a moment. "I do not know that I can," she answered. "I can only repeat what I have said before, that it was the most awful face I have ever seen in my life. Stay, there is one thing that I remember. I noticed that half his left ear was missing." "It's the Chinaman!" I cried, with an air of triumph that I could no longer suppress, and as I said it, I took from my pocket the letter of instruction Nikola had sent me the week before, and read aloud the passage in which he referred to the one-eared Chinaman of whom I was to beware. The effect was exactly what I imagined it would be. "Do you mean to tell me I was not dreaming after all?" the Donna inquired, with a frightened expression on her face. "That is exactly what I do mean," I answered. "I am glad to have your evidence that you saw the man, for the reason that it bears out what I have been saying to our friend the captain here." Then turning to that individual, I continued, "I hope, sir, you will now see the advisability of instituting another search for this man. If I were in your place, I would turn the ship inside out, truck to keelson, as it seems to me outrageous that a rascal like this can hide himself on board, and you, the captain, be ignorant of his whereabouts." "There is no necessity to instruct me in my duty," he answered, and then going to the companion, called down it for the steward, who presently made his appearance on deck. "Williams," said the skipper, "Dr. Ingleby informs me that a theft was committed in his cabin last night. He declares that a man made his way into the saloon, visiting not only his berth, but that of Don Miguel de Moreno. How do you account for this?" "Dr. Ingleby did say something to me about it this morning, sir," the steward replied. "But to tell you the plain truth, sir, I don't exactly know what to think of it. It's the first time I've ever known such a thing happen. Of course, I shouldn't like to say as how Dr. Ingleby was mistaken." "You had better not," I replied, so sharply that the man jumped with surprise. "Anyway, sir," the steward continued, "I feel certain that if the man had come aft I should have heard him. I'm a light sleeper, as the saying is, and I believe that a cat coming down the companion ladder would be enough to waken me, much less a man." "On this occasion you must have slept sounder than usual," I said. "At any rate, the fact remains that the man did come, and I have asked you once more, Captain, what you intend to do to find my stolen property." "I must take time to consider the matter," the captain replied. "If the man is aboard the ship, as you assert, I will find him, and if I do find him, he'd better look out for squalls, so that's all I can say. And at the same time," I added, "I hope you will severely punish any member of your crew who may have been instrumental in secreting him on board." As I said this, I glanced at the steward, and it seemed to me that his always sallow face became even paler than usual. "You need not bother yourself about that," said the skipper. "You may be sure I shall do so." Then lifting his cap to Dona Consuelo, he went forward along the deck, while the steward, having informed us that breakfast was upon the table, returned to the companion ladder and disappeared below. "What does all this mystery mean, Dr. Ingleby?" inquired my companion, as we turned and walked aft together. "It means there is more at the back of it than meets the eye," I replied. "Before I left London I was warned by Dr. Nikola, as you heard me say just now, to beware of a certain Asiatic with only half an ear. What Nikola had feared he would do I have no notion, but there seems to be no doubt that this is the man." "But he has done us no harm," she replied, "beyond frightening me. So if the captain takes care that he does not come as far as the saloon again, it does not seem to me that we need think any more about him." "But he has done us harm," I asserted, "grievous harm. He has stolen the medication with which I treated your great-grandfather so successfully yesterday." On hearing this, she gave a little start. "Do you mean that if he should become ill again, the same way that he did yesterday, you would be unable to save him?" she inquired, almost breathlessly. I cannot say anything about that, I answered. I should, of course, do my best, but I must confess the loss of those drugs is a very serious matter for me. They are exceedingly valuable, and were specially entrusted to my care. And you think that Dr. Nicola will be angry with you for having lost them? She said. I'm very much afraid he will, I answered. But if he is, I must put up with it. But let us now come below to breakfast. With that, I led her along the deck and down the companion ladder to the saloon. Before we sit down to our meal, I think it would perhaps be as well if I saw your great-grandfather, I said. I should like to convince myself that he is none the worse for his attack yesterday. Upon this, we entered the cabin together. I bent over the recumbent figure of the old man. He lay just as he had done on the previous day. His long, thin hands were clasped upon his breast, and his eyes looked upward just as I remembered seeing them. For all the difference that was to be seen, he might have never moved since I had left him so many hours before. He is awake, whispered his great-granddaughter, who had looked at him over my shoulder. Then, raising her voice a little, she continued, still in English, This is Dr. Ingleby, grandfather, whom your friend Dr. Nicola has sent to take care of you. I thank you, sir, for your kindness, replied the old man, in a voice that was a little louder than a whisper. You must forgive me if my reception of you appears somewhat discourteous, but I am very feeble. A month ago I celebrated my 98th birthday, and at such an age, I venture to assert, much may be forgiven a man. Pray do not apologise, I replied. I am indeed glad to find you looking so much better this morning. If to be still alive is to be better, then I suppose I must be, he answered in a tone that was almost one of regret, and then continued, The days of our age are 80 years and 10, and though men be so strong that they come to 80 years, yet is their strength but labour and sorrow, aye, labour and sorrow. Come, sir, I said, you must not talk like this. You are not very comfortable here, but we are nearly at our journey's end. Once there, you will be able to rest more quietly and in greater comfort than it is possible for you to do in this tiny cabin. You speak well, he answered, when you say that I am nearly at my journey's end. God knows I am near it, very, very near it. The wonder is I have not reached it long since. But it will come at last, and when it does I shall rest, as you say, more quietly than in this tiny cabin. Seeing that in his present humour there was not much to be done with him, I completed my examination and gave certain instructions to his great-granddaughter, and then left the cabin feeling very much as if I had stepped into the 19th out of another and quite different century. Breakfast was laid in the saloon, and as the steward informed me that the skipper invariably had his sent forward to the chart room, while the Donna Consuelo usually partook of hers by the old gentleman's bedside, I sat down to it alone. The steward waited upon me a trifle nervously, I thought, and with an obsequiousness that told me he was anxious to make up to me for the robbery of the night before. Whatever he might think, however, I had not the smallest intention of allowing myself to be drawn into a discussion with him on the subject. The matter would have to be settled some way or another when we reached our destination, and then, in all probability, Nikola would look after it for himself. Whatever else may be said of the good ship Donna Mercedes, her warmest admirers could scarcely assert that she possessed a wonderful turn of speed. Even with everything in her favour, it was as much as the chief engineer could do to knock 9 knots out of her. But on the present occasion 7 was somewhere near her mark. For this reason, instead of reaching our destination at midday, as I had hoped we would do, night had closed in upon us before we had crossed the bar and could count ourselves safely in the river, while 5 bells in the first watch had been sounded before we lay at anchor in the Tyneside. As soon as I heard the cable rattling out through the hawse hole, I made my way back to the deck. The night was a dark one, and a more interesting picture than I had before me then could scarcely be imagined. Around me on every side were ships, colliers, tramps, passenger vessels, and merchantmen of every possible sort and description. The lights of the city could be plainly distinguished, and innumerable tongues of fire containing all the colours of the rainbow flashed up continually from factory chimneys. A couple of steam launches were lying alongside, with at least a dozen small boats, and thinking Nikola might be in one of them, I went forward to the gangway in search of him. But though I scanned the faces below me, his was not among them, for the reason that we were so late getting into the river, and knowing that the vessel would be likely to remain for some time to come, I argued that in all probability he had been put off boarding her until the morning. I accordingly turned away and was about to walk aft when a hand was placed on my shoulder. "Well, friend Ingleby," said a voice that there was no mistaking, and which I should have known anywhere, "what sort of a voyage have you had, and how is your patient progressing?" "Dr. Nikola!" I cried in astonishment as I turned and found him standing before me. "I was just looking for you in the boats alongside. I had no idea you were on board." "I came up by the other gangway," Nikola replied. "But you have not answered my question. How is your patient?" "He is still alive," I answered, "and I fancy, if possible, a little better than when we left London. But he is so feeble that to speak of his being well seems almost a sarcasm. Yesterday, for a few moments, I thought he was gone, but with the help of the drugs you gave me, I managed to bring him round again. This morning he was strong enough to converse with me." "I am pleased to hear it," he replied. "You have done admirably, and I congratulate you. Now we must think about their transshipment." "Transshipment?" I replied. "Is it possible they have to make another journey?" "It is more than possible." "It is quite certain," he answered. "Allerdeyne Castle is a matter of some 50 miles up the coast, and a steam yacht will take us there. A bed has been prepared for the old gentleman in the saloon, and all we have to do is get him off this boat and on board her. You'd better let me have those drugs, and I'll mix him up a slight stimulus. He'll need it." This was the question I had been dreading all along, but the die was cast, and willy-nilly the position had to be faced. "I should like to speak to you upon that matter," I said. "I very much fear that you will consider me to blame for not having exercised greater care over them, but I had no idea they would be of any value to any one who did not know the use of them." "Pray, what do you mean?" he asked with a look of astonishment that I believe was more than half assumed. "To what are you alluding? Have you had an accident with the drugs?" While we had been talking, we had walked along the main deck, and were approaching the entrance leading therefrom to the cubby, the light from which fell upon his face. There was a look upon it that I did not like. When he was in an affable mood, Nikola's countenance was singularly prepossessing. When, however, he was put out by anything, it was the face of a devil rather than a man. "I exceedingly regret having to inform you that last night the drugs in question were stolen from my cabin." In a moment he was all excitement. "By the man of whom I bade you be beware, of course, the one-eared Chinaman?" "The same," I answered, and went on to inform him of all that had transpired since my arrival on board, including my trouble with the captain, and the suspicions I entertained, without much foundation, I'm afraid, against the steward. He heard me out without speaking, and when I had finished bade me wait on deck while he went below to the Moreno's cabin. While he was gone, I strolled to the side and once more stood watching the lights reflected in the water below. On an old tramp steamer, a short distance astern of us, a man was singing. It was one of Chevalier's Coster songs, and I could recognise the words quite distinctly. The last time I had heard that song was in Cape Coast Castle, just after I had recovered from my attack of fever, and I was still pursuing the train of thought it conjured up, when I noticed a boat drawing into the circle of light to which I have just alluded. It contained 2 men, one of whom was standing up while the other rowed. A second or two later they had come close enough to me to see the face of the man in the bows. To my amazement he was a Chinaman. So overwhelming was my astonishment that I uttered an involuntary cry, and running to the skylight called to Nikola to come on deck. Then bounding to the bulwarks again, I looked for the boat, but it was too late. Either they had achieved their object, or my prompt action had given them a fright. At any rate, they were gone. "What do you want?" cried Nikola, who by this time had reached the deck. "The Chinaman," I cried. "I saw one of them a moment ago in a boat alongside." "Where are they now?" he inquired. "I cannot see them. They've disappeared into the darkness again. But when I called to you, they were scarcely 20 yards away. What does their presence here signify, do you think?" "It signifies that they know I am on board," answered Nikola, with a queer sort of smile upon his face. "It means also that although this is the 19th century and law-abiding land of England, if we were to venture a little out of the beaten track ashore tonight, you and I would stand a very fair chance of having our throats cut before morning. It has one other meaning, and that is that you and I must play the old game of the partridge in its nest, and lure them away from this boat while the skipper transfers Don Miguel and his great-granddaughter to the yacht I have waiting down the river." "That's all very well," I interrupted, "but I'm not at all sure the skipper would be willing. To put it bluntly, he and I have already had a few words together over this matter." "That will make no difference," Nikola answered. "I assure you, you need have no fear that he will play us false. He knows me far too well to attempt that. I will confer with him at once, and while I am doing so, you had better get your traps together. We will then go ashore and do our best to draw these rascals off the scent." So saying, Nikola made his way forward towards the chart room, while I went through the cuddy to my own berth. The steward carried my bags out onto the main deck. After I had spoken a word or two with Dona Consuelo, I followed him. 5 minutes later Nikola joined me, accompanied by the captain. I had bidden the latter good-bye earlier in the evening, and Nikola was giving him one last word of advice, when I happened to glance towards the alleyway on the port side. Imagine my surprise, nay, I might almost say my consternation, on beholding, standing in the dark by the corner of the main hatch, the same mysterious Chinaman who I had felt certain had committed the robbery of the drugs the previous night. "Look, look!" I cried to my companions. "See, there is the man again." They wheeled round and looked in the direction to which I pointed. At the same time the man's right arm went up, and from where I stood I could see something glittering in the palm. An inspiration, how or by what occasion I shall never be able to understand, induced me to seize Nikola by the arm, to swing him behind me. It was well that I did so, for almost before we could realise what was happening, a knife was thrown, and stood embedded a good 3 inches in the bulwark, exactly behind where Nikola had been standing an instant before. And springing to the ladder which leads from the main to the hurricane deck, he raced up it, jumped onto the rail, and dived headlong into the water alongside. By the time we reached the deck whence he had taken his departure, all we could see was a boat pulling swiftly in the direction of the shore. "That settles it, friend Ingleby," said Nikola. "We have no alternative now but to make our way ashore and do as I proposed. If you are ready, come along. I think I can safely promise you an adventure." End of chapter 4.